Hey guys, so this is kind of a quick activity that we're going to do, just this sort of kind of presentation and a little quiz at the end. And what we're going to kind of talk about is specifically about those reputations or getting in those other perspectives that you're supposed to be putting in your essay. So just thinking about what kind of other perspectives might you need to address, how best to do that, where you might be able to put it in your paper, and kind of also dealing with this idea of how objective or subjective should you be when you're arguing, especially when you're dealing with other perspectives. So kind of building on what we did in class a little bit. So the first part is addressing other perspectives. So a couple of quick tie-ins for rhetorical appeals. Addressing other perspectives is a strategy for building ethos. Also because it's going to, if you do it right, it's going to show that you're fair-minded and that you're trying as best you can to create an unbiased, objective argument. It's also going to build kind of into the logic of your argument, because now that you've explained this other perspective and maybe pointed out what might be good about it, what concerns are valid, got your audience to trust you, now you're also kind of set up to then be able to kind of show and explain how your perspective, your solution, your theory, your concern is possibly like more valid, will work better. So it kind of sets you up for your argument to then be stronger. So here are a couple of just tips for getting started in terms of thinking about how you're going to handle your counter arguments and bringing those into your paper. Once you have some counter arguments kind of in mind, you have to think about how you want to respond to those. So two questions you might be able to think about are, one, are you going to concede that your opponent has a point? So pointing out something that is actually maybe true or valid about their perspective, but then explain why your audience should nonetheless accept your argument because it's better or stronger in some way. Or are you going to present the other side but then possibly reject it and then explain why it's mistaken, which brings you back to that the idea of the argument of clearing up misconceptions or wrong thinking or stereotypes. Either way, the goal is to address other perspectives, but you still want readers to really be thinking about your perspective, understanding why it makes sense, wanting them to kind of think about it, and that's why you're writing this paper, is to be for your perspective and your results from your research to be heard. So you want to leave your reader with that sense that your argument is stronger, or at least leave them thinking about it. So you never want to anchor with the other side. Like you never want to have your whole argument, your perspective, and your last paragraph be a positive point for the other side and then conclude, because it kind of, it messes up the flow of the ideas, and then readers don't know what actual point it is you're trying to make. So it kind of leaves them hanging in a way. So you always want to anchor. So if you are talking about, you wouldn't be talking about positives and negatives, but say you were, and you really wanted people to walk away with the positives, you wouldn't have the last part of your paper be about negatives, because that wouldn't really make a lot of sense, and it would kind of confuse your reader, because it wouldn't be kind of going back to the thesis statement or the point that you said you wanted them to walk away with. The other one is when you're summarizing opposing arguments and kind of talking about them, be charitable. We talked about this in class, making sure you're wording them fairly and objectively. If you're trying to attack it, it's going to hurt your credibility. It's usually better to talk about 1 to 2 sort of serious counter arguments in depth. You don't want to just list a whole lot of different perspectives that you're not then going to talk about. So it might be better to devote attention to 1 or 2 kind of stronger counter arguments, or counter arguments that people are more familiar with. And you want to make sure that, again, your refutation is consistent with your original argument, which then also kind of brings me back to the point of like why you wouldn't want to anchor with the other perspective and leave that, because you want for the last things people to read to be connected to what you want them to walk away with, or your end game. And then the next thing you want to think about, or have to think about, is where you're going to put it. And there's actually a lot of different strategies. There's no rule for where you have to put it. This is one of the reasons that writing sucks so much, is that there's a lot of decisions that you have to make, and it's all completely situational depending on what you're writing about, who your audience is. There's a lot of decision making. You could put it at the beginning. If your issue is well known, or you're assuming that your audience already knows a lot about the issue, then it's best to address those concerns up front. So if it's like a controversial topic, or you're writing to other people in the field, addressing concerns up front would probably be best, because if you address them later, they're going to spend the whole paper wondering when you're going to address it, and it's going to be in the forefront of their mind. So it's best to get it out of the way. You could do it at the end. So if the issue isn't well known, you could give your whole argument and then say, however, other people disagree, and explain some of the other concerns, but then refute it and still bring it back to your point, so that everything is clear. The last two get a little tricky. Partial is kind of where you do it kind of where needed. So if you have an essay that's arranged topically, then not all of your topics might have other perspectives. You might have a lot of like stronger argument or counter arguments or studies that are valid for different points that you want to bring up in different parts of your paper. So again, you might have one section where there are a lot of counter arguments about this point that you're going to then refute and talk about, but then there might not be as many in another. So it just kind of gives you, the ability to kind of decide where you want to put it. A complete refutation is, and we talked about this in class a little bit too, the entire argument rests on refuting or exposing some sort of problem with a current idea or kind of a current way of doing things. So clearing up misconceptions. So where each point is kind of, each part of your paper or each subsection is kind of arranged around explaining what the other point is, or what the perspective or the stereotype or the misconception is, explaining where it comes from, why people have it, and why it's a misconception, and then kind of clear that up. Okay, so once you've decided what other perspectives you're going to talk about, or other solutions, or other ideas, and you know kind of where you're going to talk about it, you have to decide what kind of refutation it is. Some people think that if it's a refutation, it has to be specific. This means where you have a set source, like you're talking about a study that was done by one or more people, and you're trying to refute that study. That would be an example of a specific refutation, where you say according to this person or according to this study. It's perfectly okay to have a general refutation where it's kind of brief, and it just has a lead in, like some argue that, or a common misconception is this, or a common perception is this, or a lot of people believe, or a lot of people support, or many doctors conclude, and have it be more like this idea from this group of people, and talk about it that way. So it doesn't always have to be attached to a specific source in order for it to count as addressing another perspective. But a quick clarification that I want to add in is whether or not you're doing general or specific ways of bringing in your counter arguments and talking about them. Even if you're doing a general refutation and you're saying some argue that blah blah blah, you still want to include a source to help explain that perspective or show that a lot of people have it. So you might like pull in then like a news article or a current policy or something from social media, something that shows that a lot of people do in fact hold this position, and you're not just making all that up. So again, like you're going to use a source, or maybe one or two sources specifically to refute those if you're doing a specific refutation. But you might, in a general refutation, be saying, some argue this, and you're going to describe it, and then maybe use a source to help you show that. But you're not specifically refuting that source. It's the whole perspective that you're talking about there. Something really quick that I want you to do is, I'd like for you to put this in your notebook. If you want to put this on on the draft, the outline that you're working on, that would be fine. This is to kind of help you think about where those perspectives are going to go. So I want you to think about a couple of things. One, what other perspectives will you address? Have you covered that yet or thought about that yet? How much of your essay is focused on other perspectives? So is this a complete refutation? Is this, you don't really have, you have some general things you want to talk about. Are these perspectives more general, or do you have specific sources you're going to talk about? And where's the best place to put them? And the last section of this is going to be kind of about objective writing specifically, and how to kind of balance that with the subjective kind of writing that we're doing. I'm going to be honest, like it's really tricky to find that balance. So it's kind of why we're sort of overviewing it as something to practice. So I kind of want to take a quick second and just define like what I mean just when I say objective writing. So it's writing that's impersonal, precise, very concise also. Usually has like a passive description of events or other perspectives and information. Usually when you are explaining other ideas, it's best to sound passive and removed, because it's one way of making sure that you're not sounding biased, that you're not getting your emotion in there when you're talking about those things. A passive description of events like reporting, those kinds of things are usually appropriate. It is writing without passion or personal interest, which kind of gets back to not sounding overly emotional. You do want to write in a way that gets people interested, and then maybe even shows your stake in the issue. But sometimes it's not appropriate to write in a way that's overly, I guess, like with a stake in the issue to the point that it makes you seem like you might not be being honest or truthful. It's writing that stays invisible. So like your annotated bibliographies are supposed to be completely objective. No passion, no personal interest, no writerly presence in the text. It's just here's what it's about. Here's what's useful. There's not a need to engage the audience because you're assuming that the audience is there because they want to find sources to read. So you don't really need to interest them in anything specific. So it should be very concise and personal, not engaging, to the point. So it's a very different kind of writing. And when you're thinking about objectivity versus subjectivity, there are some ways that they're very different. Objective writing has no personal analysis, questioning, interpretation, whereas subjective writing usually does have a lot of these things. We think of something as being very subjective if it's all opinion, or based on values. We tend to think about like personal blogs as being completely subjective, and not because it doesn't have any research and has a lot of opinion. There is some subjective writing that does include research, and anytime you're including your own like interpretation or question or observations, you are including some things that can be subjective, but you want to make sure you're combining that with unbiased research, with lots of knowledge, with considering other perspectives. That's a way of keeping it balanced, because this kind of writing should be contributing to the conversation. And if lots of people aren't sharing their own interpretations or questions or analysis, then no one is really hearing anything out or seeing how other people view things, and then progress doesn't get made. So this kind of writing is important, even though you are trying to kind of keep that balance. So some examples of objective versus subjective writing. First one, 47% of Americans pay no federal income tax. These people believe they are victims and would never vote for a Republican candidate. So in this quote, this first part is objective. 47% of Americans pay no federal income tax. That's a measurable, and I know we talked about like not to just buy into all studies, but let's say that this is completely true. You still would want to look at the study and make sure, but 47% of Americans pay no federal income tax might be something you could absolutely verify from a reliable study. But then this second statement up here, these people believe they are victims and would never vote for a Republican candidate. That's a subjective statement. It's a personal viewpoint based on a fact. So kind of one way that they're kind of mixed, can be mixed together. Apple only allows apps that the company has approved to be installed on their devices. The company does not care about openness of their platform. Again, the first statement is objective, like this is an event. This is probably something you could easily verify is true. However, the second part, the company does not care, is someone's opinion or interpretation about that company based on a policy that they have. I would also want to point out that saying that your analysis can also be tapered with a bit of careful wording and objective language. For example, I would argue that to say the company does not care is a subjective statement that you could not prove, and it's very sweeping and emotional, and so it makes the writer seem a little bit biased. So you could call into question this practice without necessarily wording it this way. So careful wording is very important. So some things about objective versus subjective language. Personal pronouns can imply subjectivity. Questions can be subjective because they can be leading. We use questions to get people to think about things in a certain way without actually saying it. Absolutes can reveal bias and emotional thinking. We've talked about that already, saying things like always, never, everyone. It's always more realistic to say many people believe this. Often this is true. Presentation of ideas is tricky. If you're using like hyperbole, like certain like saying strategies like exaggeration, evaluative, and emotional words, it can still make you seem biased. So you have to balance it by refraining, using wording and language that is not going to reveal you as overly emotional or dogmatic, which is where you won't consider what someone else has to say, or absolute, which makes it seem like you're completely set in what you think, and you're not going to consider what anyone has to say. You feel like you're right. That's it. So careful wording is really important. Signal phrases, which we've talked about and practiced with the annotated bibliography, because they do really improve objectivity and help the reader know whose opinions are whose, yours or the writer. So we're going to do a quick review and bring this back, even though I know you've seen it before. So signal phrases and those author signals do help create those fences or frames around information from outside sources, so that it creates clarity for the reader. It's according to Dr. So-and-so, and including that quote or paraphrase, and then commenting on it, so we know when it starts and stops. So it helps kind of make that distinction between the writer and the source clear, okay? And I just kind of want to point out then, like, how this works. If you said, again, the merits of cancer screening must be reappraised, that's a point. It's a debatable point. I don't know whose debatable point it is, but if you did a general signal phrase, doctors may conclude that. I know it's doctors' opinions, the writer's talking about it, but the opinion is not necessarily theirs. Same thing if you're saying, however, the merits of cancer screening are currently debated by new data, and then you include a quote. I don't know where that quote comes from. If you included a signal phrase, I would have, according to Dr. Dan Boyd, and then some information about him, the director of cancer research at the Charlotte Clinic, who just produced one of the new studies on cancer screening. So it's for the clarity purposes that we talked about with the annotated bibliography. But then to build off of that, it also adds this objective way of wording and removing yourself from things you don't want to seem overly emotional about. Like when you're refuting other perspectives, it's best to stay passive, stay objective when you're talking about these other perspectives, because again, it avoids getting in your bias, your emotion, and any subjective interpretation or analysis or opinion that might be based on value instead of on the interpretation of a fact or a study or a source. So for your digital essay, just a couple of quick tips to wrap up. Balance opinions by maintaining a fair-minded perspective and appropriate language and wording. Language and wording is really important when it comes to having your audience see that you are fair-minded and that you're not overly emotional. A lot of it is really just in how you chose to word something. Like logical fallacies, you want to avoid making debatable points that aren't paired with evidence. So we talked about that today. One of the ways to make sure you're avoiding logical fallacies is to make sure when you make a debatable point, it's paired with at least two pieces of evidence to go with it. There's not a lot of like debatable points back to back where you sound like you're writing a blog and you're giving all kinds of opinion and there's nothing to pair it with, nothing to illustrate it, explain it, prove it. Finally, don't get overly emotional. While your essay does need pathos, remember that pathos is there to help your reader connect with the issue, to help them understand things that you're talking about, help them visualize things, see how important the issue or the problem is. But it's really easy to overdo it on emotion, so really pay attention to how you are wording things and whether or not it sounds like you are coming at things subjectively and with gut reactions and things like that, as opposed to like solid, fair-minded like analysis of evidence that you're including in the essay. So just make sure you're using emotion for the right things and that you're not overdoing it.